The most powerful navy human civilization had ever built was destroyed by a memo. In 1405, a fleet left the coast of China that Europe wouldn't be able to match for another 400 years. Ming court records describe ships over 400 feet long. Historians still argue about how accurate that number really is, but even the conservative estimates put these vessels at a scale Europe simply had nothing to compare it to. 28,000 men. Navigators, doctors, translators, botanists. A floating empire. For 28 years, an admiral named Zheng commanded that fleet to the Persian Gulf, the coast of Africa, every major port from Java to Jeddah. And then, on a single order, it was gone. Not sunk, not defeated in battle, burned by its own government. The blueprints destroyed, the shipyards dismantled. Today, the AXIOM engine restores one variable. The fleet survives the decree that killed it. Stick around because by the end of this simulation, you're going to be asking a much bigger question than, what if China explored more? You're going to be asking, how many other inevitable pieces of your world were actually just one committee meeting away from never happening? This is AXIOM. Quick request before we go further. If simulations like this are your thing, hit subscribe now, because the AXIOM engine has a lot more history left to rerun. To understand what we are changing, you need to understand what actually existed, because most people have no idea how far ahead China's navy was. By 1420, the Ming dynasty possessed the largest, most technologically advanced maritime force in the world. Watertight bulkheads, compasses, multi-masted ships that could sail closer to the wind than anything Europe would build for centuries. This wasn't exploration, this was projection of power. Tribute missions, diplomatic shows of force, trade agreements backed by the largest navy any nation had ever assembled. Zheng himself was an extraordinary figure. A Muslim eunuch from a conquered province, raised in the imperial court, who became the most trusted naval commander of Emperor Yongle. 7 voyages, 30+ countries visited, not one significant colonial conquest. A detail that matters more than you'd think, and we'll come back to it. So here's the question that should keep you up at night. If China had this fleet a full 70 years before Portugal even reached the southern tip of Africa, why isn't Beijing the center of the world today? The answer isn't technology, it's politics. When Emperor Yongle died in 1424, the court split into 2 factions that had been fighting each other for decades. On one side, the eunuch faction allied with Zheng who saw the fleet as the future of Chinese power. On the other, the Confucian scholar bureaucrats, who saw the voyages as an obscene waste of silver, funding tribute missions that brought back giraffes and spices instead of solving actual problems at home. Famine, the Mongols on the northern border, a treasury under strain. In 1433, Zheng died at sea on his 7th voyage. Without him, the fleet's political protection died too. By 1436, new ship construction was banned. Within decades, records describe it becoming a capital offense to build an ocean-going vessel with more than 2 masts. And by 1525, coastal ships were being destroyed outright. To stop smuggling, to starve pirates, and to make sure no ambitious general could ever again build a private navy powerful enough to challenge the throne. The greatest fleet in the world wasn't beaten by anyone. It was legislated out of existence by men who were afraid of what it represented. Here's our variable. The maritime faction wins that argument instead. Not a fantasy where China conquers the world, a grounded scenario where the fleet survives one crucial change in imperial succession and simply continues. Running the simulation forward from 1436. The new emperor doesn't side with the treasury hawks. The fleet is folded into a permanent state trading company, half military, half commercial, headquartered in the shipyards of Nanjing. Not tribute collection anymore. Permanent trading posts. By the 1450s, Chinese garrisons hold fortified trade stations in Malacca, Ceylon, and along the East African coast at Malindi and Mogadishu, decades before the Portuguese would even round the Cape. This is ports, garrisons, and tribute relationships, not plantations. But that network alone changes everything downstream, because it means one thing above all. When Europe arrives, China is already there. Now, this is where most people assume the simulation just ends with China wins. It doesn't. What actually happens next is stranger, and it involves a country you wouldn't expect getting pushed into an entirely different ocean. Stay with me. In our actual history, Prince Henry the Navigator launches Portugal's exploration program partly to bypass Ottoman-controlled land routes to Asian spices. The entire age of discovery is a scramble to find any other way in. In this timeline, when Portuguese caravels finally round the Cape of Good Hope in the 1480s, they don't find an open ocean waiting to be claimed. They find Chinese garrisons already holding the ports they were sailing toward. Portugal is forced into the position China occupied in real history, a smaller power negotiating access with an established maritime empire. Historians studying this exact counterfactual argue Portugal likely pivots harder toward the Atlantic instead, meaning the scramble for the Americas accelerates, not slows down. This isn't a timeline where China conquers everything. It's a timeline where China simply isn't absent from the biggest power vacuum in human history. That absence is the only reason Europe's 1500s played out the way it did. This is the question everyone asks, so let's run it honestly. Zheng's ships were built for Indian Ocean trade winds, not the Pacific crossing. The logistics of a Ming fleet beating Columbus to the Americas are far shakier than internet myths suggest, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. But a continuous, funded maritime program 70 years longer doesn't need to replicate 1492 exactly. It needs to change the balance of power Columbus sails into. Spain isn't competing against an empty ocean anymore. It's competing against a maritime rival with 70 more years of institutional shipbuilding experience than it had in reality. Every European crown expands faster and earlier because falling permanently behind is existential. The age of discovery doesn't disappear in this timeline. It gets a scoreboard. Here's the part that matters more than who wins a race across an ocean. China already had gunpowder, the compass, movable type printing and blast furnace iron centuries before Europe. In real history, those inventions diffused west, and Europe eventually iterated on them faster. In this timeline, a continuously funded state shipbuilding program keeps China's shipwrights, metallurgists and instrument makers compounding their own head start, instead of exporting it and falling behind. That's the real divergence, not conquest. China simply keeps investing in the technology it already invented, instead of banning it. Now, the responsible part of this simulation. The scholar bureaucrats who ended the voyages weren't cartoon villains. China's real, pressing problems in the 1430s, Mongol incursions, famine, a strained treasury, were genuine emergencies. Redirecting resources inward wasn't an irrational choice, and historians still debate this exact question today. What this simulation shows isn't that the historical decision was foolish. It shows how narrow the margin was, how one political faction, one succession, one treasury debate quietly redirected the next 500 years of global power. So here's what the AXIOM engine wants you to sit with. We tell the story of the modern world as if European dominance was inevitable. Geography, culture, destiny. But run the simulation back, and the real hinge wasn't a battle, an invention, or a discovery. It was a memo. A committee in Beijing deciding a fleet wasn't worth the silver. So the question isn't whether China could have led the modern world. It's how many other inevitable outcomes in your world right now are actually just memos we've never heard of. Tell me your answer below, and if you want to see which empire the AXIOM engine reruns next, subscribe, because the next simulation is already running. This has been AXIOM.